Thanks to Brian for that introduction and for all the effort that he's put into this program. I also want to thank Lindy Villa and Serra Hasselbeck for their support of this whole series. Artists and art historians have, it occurs to me, a kind of primary custodial relationship to beauty, I suppose, and being producers and interpreters of the beautiful carries with it a high degree of responsibility. And today I hazard that we won't do more than scratch the surface of some problems associated with that responsibility. So rather than make too many excuses for that, I think we should just jump in and invite conversation after the presentations take place, each of which will last for about 15 minutes, okay? So we'll start with Matt Rich, who is the newest member of the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History faculty. Matt studied at Brown University and received his MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He also attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Skowhegan, Maine. His paintings have been exhibited throughout the world, and he maintains an active curatorial practice in addition to the regular exhibitions of his work, which seem to take place every week. Matt's the recipient of numerous prestigious awards from the Terra Foundation for American Art, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and most recently, together with Victoria Fu, Matt was awarded the San Diego Art Prize. Matt has taught at USD since last year. If you don't mind, I'll introduce Sally, and then we can just do it in succession. Sally Yard, it occurs to me, needs no introduction to this audience. Since receiving her degrees in art history from Harvard and Princeton universities, she's been a much beloved professor of art history and is the former chair of the Fine Arts Department here at USD. Sally has authored dozens of books and essays on a diverse set of topics, usually centered on modern and contemporary art. Sally is especially admired for her critical contributions to scholarship on Willem de Kooning, Christo, Francis Bacon, as well as many others, and for her numerous penetrating studies of public art history. Sally was also one of the curatorial masterminds behind the legendary series of exhibitions about art along the border between San Diego and Tijuana called Insight, and edited several of the publications that accompanied those programs. She's presently completing work on a book-length study on Robert Irwin. So we'll start with Matt, then go directly to Sally, and then I'll finish up before we open up the floor to all of you to some questions. Matt?
Very much, Derrick, and thank you, Brian, for this invitation. Happy to be here alongside two distinguished colleagues. And happy to be here speaking on this topic. I'm going to speak, because I'm in teaching mode at this point in the semester, sort of launching my classes, and I'm going to sort of think about the three classes that I'm teaching. One last semester, Designing for Social Space, which took a view of experience and interactivity in social space and thinking about systems. This semester I'm teaching a class on color theory, and color broadly speaking in the world, and also a class called Interdisciplinary 2D Studio, which seeks to sort of define what is two-dimensional art making beyond the sort of traditions of painting, drawing, printmaking, etc. And so thinking about this pedagogic perspective, I'm drawing some examples from these different realms and some quotations as well that speak to that. And I'm going to quickly sort of say I don't really think or talk about beauty. I'm going to throw the emergency brake immediately and say that that's on a list of words, of words that I don't really ever mention or think about. Truth, genuine, beauty, because it at least in my teaching, has no role in undergraduate teaching, because it's hard to articulate, because it seems personal. It seems based on a lot of things that are sort of hard to define in a granular level, which is exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to sort of demystify art making, break it down in order for the students to sort of build it up again. And thinking about beauty, and thinking about not thinking about beauty, and thinking about not using that word, but thinking about attraction, visual attraction. I'm a painter personally, and I put one of my paintings in this presentation. So I'm very interested in the way things look and how visual things can communicate. And I think that's the word that I think mostly about is communication, something that that I think grounds the visual art practice in a university setting. You have an idea and you want to communicate it. And I think that is something that's shared across a lot of disciplines. So I think a lot about the mechanisms of communication, and one of them clearly is when you're dealing with painting, drawing, etc., is, the visual principles: color, line, shape, texture, and this is a demonstration or an illustration of a value scale with this sort of medium value sort of connected, and this sort of wonderment that you get from very basic deployments of color theory, right? Color in space, color in front of you, and so really driving home the idea that visual art making can communicate a great many ideas. So again, I spend most of my time deconstructing notions, and part of that is thinking about visual principles, how things work, how values work, how colors work, what is a saturated color, what is an unsaturated color, but then also acknowledging that there is something personal going on, some sort of a reaction to things. That's, experience is, and engagement is emotional. So there is something hard to pin down and specific. There's something necessarily plural about that idea. In the classroom, you have 15 people in the room. I'm not seeking to build up some sort of universal, collective, singular notion. I'm much more interested in the maintaining this sort of plurality. What do you bring to the table? What are your experiences? Where do you want to go? What are your references? What are your triggers? What are your, et cetera? What makes you you, and how does that inform the way you look? I was just talking to my class about Roland Barthes' SZ and thinking about rereading as a sort of creative practice, in parallel to or over top of or instead of writing as a sort of creative practice. So it's very important to understand how visual hierarchies work in an image. You thinking about again, engagement and beauty, or sorry, I've said I wouldn't use that word. Engagement and sort of visual attraction. Thinking about this painting from 2011, Nicole Eisenman. It was in the Whitney Biennial in 2012, I think. It's called The Breakup. So it's a sort of everyday depiction of something, I guess, that happens now. I've never been broken up over text message, but I think it happens, right? This is a BlackBerry, and there is color sort of directs your eye in a certain way, right, to this sort of bright, brightest colors, which also happen to be some of the sort of most highly saturated colors. For example, the orange ears, and it's a depiction of an ear, and it's a depiction of a head, it's a depiction of eyes, a nose, a mouth, and fingers holding a cell phone. But I also think that this orange color communicates something else, right? And I can't quite pinpoint it because it's somewhere between this image and you and your experience and your mind and your brain. So there is something sort of unspeakable about that, which I'm interested in. I think we can begin to talk about the sort of green of the face being sort of maybe a green of sickness, and have you ever felt something disappointing in your life, and did you feel like you turned to color, right? I mean, there's certainly references to that sort of, color palette of a face as a portrait of an emotion. But the sort of roughness of a texture, around the mouth, the sort of the burning nose. But what exactly, how are you responding to that sort of purpley fuchsia color, and how does that tap into your personal experience? So again, a combination of visual principles, which we can all talk about, a shared language, but then something unspeakable, unnameable, hard to pinpoint, because it's personal, it's yours. So I think a lot about emotions as well, and I'm putting my money where my mouth is. This is one of my pieces from 2015, and it is not a representational piece, but I do think in the same way that Nicole Eisenman's piece uses color to direct vision, to describe shapes in relationship to other colored shapes. And while I'm not trying to depict a breakup or an ear or a nose, I am trying to engage a spatial relationship primarily, where shapes, will push out towards you, and other shapes will pull in away from you, back into the wall. And it's a sort of complex, possibly contradictory, always sort of dynamic, unsettling spatial relationship. And I think this is very much grounded in attraction and repulsion, visual principles, and I hope to put enough in there that other people can react to that. But getting to this notion of emotion, I will say that I think a lot about Marvin Minsky, who taught at MIT for a number of years in artificial intelligence, and he wrote a book called Society of Mind in 1986, and I think it's really interesting the way he speaks about emotions, and I will quote three people, and this is the first one. So he writes, in this book, he will, quote, propose to regard emotions not as separate from thoughts in general, but as varieties or types of thoughts, each based in a different brain machine that specializes in some particular domain of thought. Later on, he says, the use of fantasies, emotional or not, is indispensable for every complicated problem-solving process. Later on, we're all so insensitive to the complexity of ordinary thought that we take the marvels of our common sense for granted. Then, whenever anyone does something outstanding, instead of trying to understand the process of thought that did the real work, we attribute that virtue to whichever superficial emotional signs we can easily discern, like motivation, passion, inspiration, or sensibility. And I think there's a way in which, in that last line especially, he's sort of dismissing these notions of passion or inspirations, expressly because they are sort of so regularly used and perhaps so inarticulate at describing exactly what they're trying to get at, right? So he wants to both acknowledge that emotions exist and acknowledge and also sort of frame them in a way that can make them seem like real building blocks for action, for activity, right? And keep in mind, he's trying to think about artificial intelligence. So if he's thinking about emotions and common sense, his end product is some sort of computer program that begins to mimic this stuff. So to be able to code that requires an understanding that sort of concretizes emotions, makes them, again, building blocks. And I'm interested also in the idea of common sense and sort of our unawareness as a 41-year-old, and however old you guys are, a lack of awareness about how complex things that we do, like holding this and pushing a button when I know I want to, and things like that. Like the common sense procedures that we do that go unnoticed, unlooked. Agnes Martin, in a 1993 interview with Irving Sandler, said, artists are intuitive. They wait for inspiration. That's what art is about, the intuitive, not the intellectual. Art about ideas stimulates ideas, but art that comes from inspiration stimulates feelings of happiness, innocence, and beauty. And I don't agree with her. I think that, I'm interested in the crossover, the joining of this sort of intuitive, which I guess indicates a sort of emotional, personal, and the idea of intellectual, which is something maybe sort of shared and important and societal or something like that. I think I'm interested in those two things as inextricably bound together. So I think it's both. But I like the fact that the reason why I didn't just throw Agnes Martin to the wolves, I didn't read that to disagree with her, but I think it's useful because she spells out notions that connect experience to the maker. And I think that's a very productive relationship in the classroom and in my own studio, and I think, broadly speaking, something that we can think a lot about. So it drives home the idea that artwork isn't a destination, right? So this sort of vessel of beauty, or this sort of announcement of beauty, or this sort of depiction of beauty, but an artwork is much more of a vehicle for experience and exploration. It's a sort of it's a place to pass through. It's a place to jump off from. And to illustrate this point, before I was a teacher, I worked in galleries and museums handling art, and in 2001, I worked at Pace Gallery in their warehouse, and this painting came in direct from the studio, and so one of the jobs we did was to take it, and it's about 6 feet by 6 feet, and to take it and to put a special backing on it before it went to the framer, before the photographer came, and before it went to the framer, before it was exhibited. And so I was holding this painting on the backside, and on the stretcher bars it was written happiness. And she was, how old was she at that point? She was born something. She was in her 70s or 80s maybe at that point. I could see her hand, her Sharpie hand, and it was crossed out. Happiness was crossed out. And next to it was written, little children loving love. And I was like, I guess she didn't nail it with the happiness. And so so little children loving love was the kind of happiness that she was interested in. But it seemed really like, another illustration of this point where it was narrative, right? That happiness was broken down into this sort of narrative, this situational forward description, which I thought was a kind of a nice idea. Antoni Tapis, writing a statement, I Am Catalan, 1971. Painting is a way of reflecting on life, and reflection is more active than simple contemplation. It is the manifestation of a will to discern reality, to dig into it, to collaborate in its discovery and its understanding. To paint is also to create reality. Later in the text he says, Tirelessly, we must try to habituate the public to consider that there are 1,000 things worthy of being classified in the category of art. So this is a piece of his called Rag and String from 1967. It's oil and sand on cardboard mounted on canvas. This piece is Gray and Green Painting, 1957, oil paint, epoxy resin, marble dust on canvas. And I read these two quotes because I think it gets a little bit closer to this notion of art collaborating with the world, or becoming a sort of more everyday notion. Again, sort of thinking about bringing down these notions in a way that I can speak to my students, and he is sort of bringing it down, bringing painting, art making, the materials of painting down to the level where literally in the statement he's talking about how artists can elevate trash, right? You can take trash and reframe it. And I think you can see in these paintings that you would have to talk about the language of sort of sidewalk making and concrete, tradesmen, even more so than, the history of fine art painting. You'd have to talk about both of those sort of with equal seriousness. And so, the idea of using the word collaboration, I think, is really interesting because I think it suggests not only a collaboration with materials that exist outside of the bounds of the tradition of painting, but also a collaboration with a viewer as well, since he's thinking about actively trying to broaden the language around art making. So again, I think that, in relationship to a singular idea of beauty, I think about what happens when you pluralize that. So, and I'll end with three pieces and a statement by the artist Merle Laderman Euclides. This is Social Mirror in 1983. So the quick story about her is in 1969 she had a child and she was taking care of the child, and she began to rethink that, the process, the labor of doing that, and she thought about maintenance in a certain way. In 1969 she wrote a manifesto. I will read that now. Quote, "I am an artist, I am a woman, I am a wife, I am a mother." Random order. "I do a hell of a lot of washing, cleaning, cooking, renewing, supporting, preserving, etc. Also, up to now separately, I do art." These are parentheses. "Now, I will simply do these maintenance everyday things and flush them up to consciousness, exhibit them as art. I will live in the museum, and I customarily do at home with my husband and my baby for the duration of the exhibition. Right? Or do you want me around at night? I would come in every day and do all of these things as public art activities. I will sweep and wax the floors, dust everything, wash the walls, i.e. floor paintings, dustworks, soap sculpture, wall paintings, cook, invite people to eat, make agglomerations and dispositions of functional refuse. The exhibition area might look empty of art, but it will be maintained in full public view." So this is written as if a proposal for an exhibition called CARE, and this is a manifestation of that at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. It exists now as 12 photographs of documentation, and these are 3 of them where she's dumping out water, washing the steps, mopping the grounds. She did a set of actions outside, caring for the museum, and then a set of actions inside, inserting, she's using a traditional mop here, although I'm not sure you don't generally use mops outside, but using diapers to wipe the floors on the inside. So she expanded this notion of maintenance from her home, from her baby, from the diapers, to an art institution. And then, I know I'm jumping around here a little bit, but this is a piece called Social Mirror from 14 years later, where she mirrored the outside of New York's city sanitation trucks with mirrors, so when you would look at it, you would see the reflection of the crowd. And I think I want to pause here and say, one of the stunning things about this piece, I think, is the ability to find an unlikely, unusual venue for art making, production, but also the craft of it, right? The sort of I will use the word stunning, the stunning nature of this. As it, and I think of, if I could think of a painter reference, I would think of Richard Estes or something like that. But where it's sort of constantly sort of capturing or reframing visions of the city in reflection. And it's just, so I just think it's a stunning object, right? And then this piece called Touching Sanitation, where she, over the course of 3 years, 1977 to 1980, she shook hands with every New York City sanitation worker. Touched the hands of every single one of them. So there was a way in which she was sort of marking, making visible, making physical with her hand, literally, the labor, the scale of the New York Department of Sanitation. And what this adds up to, I think, is the sort of flip side of beauty, which is, this is If you stopped collecting trash, you would quickly notice it. In a place like New York City, it would probably be unlivable in 3 days, or I don't know, a week, that's my guess. Maybe even a day, I don't know. But there's the way in which she makes the supporting role of maintenance, taking care of things, which is an incredible amount of labor and further is takes an incredible amount of skill, thought, design, and she makes that supporting role the lead, right? So she says she's trying to sort of elevate the idea of maintenance as a pivotal part of all development and all progress in society, essentially. And I think that's a sort of a beautiful place to end my presentation, bringing it all the way down to the ground, right? So thank you very much, and Sally, you're.
I'm just going to actually, apropos of something Matt was talking about, recall a wonderful remark that was made by the great Islamic art scholar OLED Grabar in a lecture at some point that I've never forgotten this sort of remark that he made. He was talking about beauty and the beauty of actually of Islamic gardens. And he wanted to make clear that beauty is incredibly subjective. So he said, okay, imagine it, you're in love with someone. You describe them to your friend. They are the most beautiful, the most ideal, the most perfect person in the world. But why isn't everybody else in love with them? And it was, I think it was a good way to underscore this notion of the particularity, the individuality at stake. So I thought I would begin. An image that surely comes to mind when we think about perhaps beauty in art, the Mona Lisa. And I thought I would quote a very quick sentence or two from Leonardo da Vinci, who observed that the painter is master of all the things that may come to man's mind. And so if he wishes to see beauties of which he may become enamored, he has the power to make them. And if he wishes to see monstrous things that terrify him, or clownish and comical things, or truly pitiful things, he is the Lord and creator of them. And he goes on then, after some other remarks, to say, and indeed that which is present in the universe in essence, presence, or imagination, he, the artist, has first in mind, and then in his hands, and these are of such excellence that as they make things, they create a proportioned harmony as instantly apparent as the harmony of nature. I, however, am a scholar of modern art. And so I suppose we're going to jump quickly into the other side of this and take a look at what happens in the thick of the First World War, the beginnings of the Dada movement, and in this case, actually a work by Marcel Duchamp called LHOOQ, which, if one hears it pronounced in this way, would be a kind of slang phrase for she has hot pants or some such phrase. It's clearly what he would call an assisted ready-made. He's gotten a reproduction of the Mona Lisa and has applied over it then this kind of juvenile graffiti, basically, of the mustache, the beard, and the kind of naughty pun beneath it. In fact, I think what's interesting is I've pondered what I would say, and I'm going to show you an incredible range of things, is that there's a very complicated relationship with beauty in the modern world, and certainly in the world of the things I've focused most of my attention on. Not that there isn't a tantalizing relationship to them. I think probably some critics, are more likely to speak of beauty than are art historians. And I think there is a gingerly relationship on the part of many to the terminology, and I think it is the language, the kind of authority of the word beauty that perhaps is a cause of reluctance amongst many 20th century figures. Indeed, the ready-mades, such as Duchamp's bottle rack of 1914, were a direct kind of affront to, an intentional kind of rebuff of notions of beauty. Duchamp would explain of this and other ready-mades. This was not made in 1914. It was bought. It is a manufactured, mass-produced bottle rack, like a kind of drying rack that we would have when we wash dishes and so on. Bought in 1914. This is actually a replica from the 1960s. It isn't original. It isn't intended to be beautiful. It isn't intended to be made by the hand of the artist. It isn't most of what we historically might traditionally expect of works of art. And indeed, Duchamp was decisive in asserting that he chose the ready-mades in what he described as a state of complete visual indifference. In the 1960s, he was on a panel at the Museum of Modern Art with the founding director of the museum, Alfred Barr Jr., and Barr said to him in the midst of the panel, "Oh, but Marcel, they look so beautiful today." And Duchamp responded, "Nobody's perfect." Reiterating this position. Pushing it certainly to the far point, I suppose, was this fountain, ready-made, of 1917, readily identifiable as a piece of plumbing which he had turned on its side and signed and dated, not with his own name, but with someone else's name, submitted to an exhibition, served on the jury for the exhibition, which was supposed to be jury-free, refused the work, caused a complete sort of revisiting of notions of what was art, I suppose, at this point. Now, through the 20th century, there are many moments where I think things that, dare I say, I would think to myself are beautiful, are made. And in fact, there are many that I love, look at for all sorts of sources of inspiration and so on. And one might sense perhaps that there was a beginning of something like that, perhaps suggested in this drawing by the artist Willem de Kooning. It's a little drawing, actually. The scale is not far off, just a little bit smaller than it appears here, called Portrait of 1940. But when we see where this is headed, we see that it is again a retreat from our conventional notions of appearance and perhaps of beauty. But I want to think about where it's headed. And so we're going to quickly just look at a little sequence of images. You can perhaps see the shifts that take place rather directly from this image toward this seated woman painting of the same year, 1940. Here I want to just mention a remark made by Baudelaire in the 1860s in which he observed, "Beauty is always bizarre. I don't mean to say that it is deliberately coldly bizarre, for in that case it would be a monster that has gone off the rails of life. I say that it always contains a hint of the bizarre, which makes it beauty in particular." As this all progresses, certainly we find that the image here, Queen of Hearts of 1944, made by de Kooning, will increasingly turn ugly, perhaps, not beautiful, troubling, vehement, lots of things, until finally these images culminate in a painting which we can't possibly recognize with its full presence here, because it is a painting that is 6 feet 4 inches high, and that scale is incredibly important to the commanding kind of presence of this painting. And so here I want to suggest that actually perhaps for me, in place of our perhaps more calm notions of beauty, de Kooning is headed towards something that I would associate instead with terribilità, something that I would associate, for example, with an image famous for its terribilità, Michelangelo's, again, towering figure, 92-inch high figure of Moses, made for the tomb of Pope Julius II. Terribilità associated with a kind of extraordinary intensity, perhaps even with the sublime so long at odds with, at war with beauty, perhaps. And then there are other reasons, too, or other processes at work. Here we're looking at, again, a 19th century image, the Grand Odalisque by Jean-Auguste Dominique. This might look sort of beautiful to our eyes now. It wasn't actually considered so beautiful by contemporary critics who felt her spine was 3 vertebrae too long and felt that the handling actually of the fabric was too, quote, Gothic in its kind of folds and so on. But it is an image that I suppose in many ways nonetheless exudes a sort of quality of beauty, as does a Grisaille version of this in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And yet I think in our time, an image like this image by Lorna Simpson, You're Fine, composed of Polaroid photographs. Now, clearly this image of a reclining female figure is very much a rebuff of the tradition, the long tradition from Venus of Urbino and so on onward of the beautiful female figure of Western art. Here back turned, kind of dressed in a clinical sort of gown, not a beautifully designed gown. All of this plays and gathers its power in part from a history of beauty, in a way turns on or turns inside out in some sense. And so too, one might remember images like this image from the 1860s, the slave market of Jean-Léon Gérard, with its deploying of, again, the female figure, so much a staple of beauty in Western art. And might, by contrast, think of the work about a century later of Eleanor Anton, a work called Carving. It is a series of small photographs taken over the course of a month, which actually simply document in a very clinical, almost mugshot-like portrait of the body way, a diet that she goes on. And over the course of the month, 10 pounds are shed, and that is the carving of the figure. But again, I think we want to read this in relationship to a long history of images of the female figure. Now, apropos of terribilità, I began to think of other images that carry with them a great sense of grandeur for me. And that grandeur need not involve beauty. It actually generally involves rather large moral questions or human matters or issues. And I thought I would just quickly show a pair of images, again, from very different moments. A neoclassical image, in many ways a very beautiful image in its balance, its harmony, its tensions, which made by Jacques-Louis David, The Oath of the Horatii, in 1785, points the way toward the French Revolution, is in the end just a little less than life-size, commanding again in its scale. Actually beautiful for me in the sense that it actually lays out with a kind of mathematical kind of proposition precision. Actually, what I read as a sort of ethical dilemma. In its historical moment, the story that this tells pits three brothers' decision to sacrifice themselves, to offer themselves as potential sacrifices in a battle to save ancient Rome. Pits this sense of public responsibility against, as one knows the story and it unfolds, against all the tragedy it will cause in private life, in familial terms. And for me, the beauty of the image is actually in the clarity, the precision with which it has basically set up a scenario for the viewer without resolving it, without answering it, but with a kind of extraordinary clarity. On a very different note, but related in this sense of a kind of grandeur of public issues, is a recent work, a work actually of the last year, made by the painter Mark Bradford, called 150 Portrait Tone. It's a work right now up at LACMA in Los Angeles, and it's a work that actually deals with, again, a very vastly important contemporary tragedy as it is set up here. So the painting was begun by Bradford, conceived by Bradford, in the wake of the shooting of Philando Castile, that shooting that was actually live streamed by his girlfriend who was sitting in the car with him. And he had been pulled over, he worked at an elementary school, and so on. And what struck the artist Bradford and what he wove into this was in fact what he was immediately incredibly moved by, incredibly struck by, which was, as he put it, the multiple subjects that Reynolds, Castile's girlfriend, the multiple subjects that Reynolds simultaneously addressed and the different spaces they occupied. Her boyfriend, Castile, who was next to her, stay with me. The text is sort of written here. The officer outside the car, please, officer, don't tell me that you just did this. God, Lord, please, Jesus, don't tell me that he's gone. As well as the unknown receiver on the other side of the live stream. Please don't tell me he just went like that. The title, 150 Portrait Tone, refers to the name and color tone of the pink acrylic that we see down at the bottom of this. Obviously, he was struck by that idea of portrait tone, a correction that hasn't been made in these paint names that has been made in crayons and so on, in which there are all kinds of assumptions about complexion and so on, who is depicted, who is depicting, and so on, built into it. So I show this as, for me, an image which has, like terribilità, a kind of grandeur that speaks to whatever it is that I consider beauty. Now I will show you some things that I think more conventionally perhaps, aspire to beauty. Piet Mondrian, composition with red, blue, and yellow. Mondrian would speak of beauty sometimes. He spoke much more of dynamic equilibrium, of tensions that made art a model of the universe, of the world. But he also wrote, the emotion of beauty is always obscured by the appearance of the object. Therefore, the object must be eliminated from the picture. And so indeed he arrived obviously at an entirely non-objective way of painting, distilled in this incredibly classical way to primary colors, vertical, horizontal lines, white and black. And then there is Matisse, The Joy of Life, a marvelously opulent painting, 8 feet wide, a pastoral image of a kind of idyllic realm. And indeed Matisse, though he wouldn't always, I think, or I'm not sure he ever actually spoke directly of beauty. I've read a lot of his writing, which is not expansive. He does speak of something that perhaps is his notion of beauty. What I dream of is, and famously observed, what I dream of is an art of balance, of purity and serenity, devoid of troubling or depressing subject matter. An art which could be for every mental worker, for the businessman as well as the man of letters, for example, a soothing, calming influence on the mind, something like a good armchair, which provides relaxation from physical fatigue. And then I thought I would show you finally the work of an artist that I'm working on a book with, who actually will certainly use the word beauty against all sort of conventions of the moment. Robert Irwin, some of you will recognize the gardens at the Getty Museum, the Central Garden. And he observed of this, the sole criterion of this sculpture garden is the experience of beauty. It is my feeling that most of our interest in art begins with our having had, at one time, a very special aesthetic experience, which inspires each of us individually to want to know more. It is in this sense that the sole ambition of this sculpture garden is to create the possibility of just such a moment. So this is to say, I think beauty is really complicated. I'm a sucker for different kinds of beauty, I suppose, but it's not a word I would very often use. I think I'd find other ways to surround it. Good, okay.
So this talk begins with a confession and a complaint. And first, the title is called Just Ugly, which is a reference to a little book that I'd recommended to Brian a few months back by the Harvard humanist Elaine Scarry called On Beauty and Being Just. And the confession is I try to read everything that Elaine Scarry writes. I think she's an incredible thinker. And the complaint is I hated this book. That this is a book in which she makes the argument, it's a compelling argument, and I really struggle with it, that by studying beauty, we improve ourselves, and by this analogous relationship to beauty, we have a chance of producing a more just world. And it's a much more complicated argument than that, but I was taken in by it as I'm taken in by most of the things that Scarry writes, except that on closer scrutiny, I felt it reduced art history and the appreciation of works of art to this kind of unfair binary that the ugly and the beautiful might be opposed to one another. And essentially, I'm not going to give you the whole argument, but she has this sense that in humanities today, there is a terrible tendency against beauty. And that could be reduced to two arguments, one of which is that by observing beautiful things, we're destructive to those things. And I sort of equate that with Barbara Kruger's poster-like image, your gaze hits the side of my face, where the objectification of something actually has the power to do it damage. Or she says that the attraction to beauty puts us on a course where we can become infatuated with the wrong sort of social arrangements. And I think that Caravaggio's narcissistic view of looking is one way to think about that binary that she set up in this otherwise, I think, seductive book. But because I knew I was going to have Brian in the audience, I thought I should bring this back momentarily, and I'll say very momentarily, to this handsome man, Edmund Burke, who thinks about beauty and ugliness in the course of his famous treatise on the sublime and the beautiful. And he actually addresses, in a short section, you probably know it, Brian, ugliness, and he says, though ugliness be the opposite to beauty. It is not the opposite to proportion and fitness. These are very important terms to Burke in terms of what makes something beautiful. For it is possible that a thing may be very ugly without proportions and with perfect fitness to any uses. Ugliness, I imagine, likewise, to be consistent enough with an idea of the sublime. But I would by no means insinuate that ugliness of itself is a sublime idea. So what I want you to think about is that ugliness could be part of the sublime, but it could never subsume the sublime, and that Burke is very careful to tease those distinctions out for us. I guess I disagree with Burke, too. And I found myself relying heavily on the work of a philosopher, Arthur Danto, who in a book called The Abuse of Beauty, which I find really has an argument that's very close to mine, which is he wants to deny that, and we've heard this in various forms from both Matt and Sally, that the history of appreciation always culminates in an appreciation of beauty. That's not necessary to think that by studying art we're always going to come up with this sort of supervaluation. The mistake, Danto says, is to believe that artistic goodness is identical with beauty, and that the perception of artistic goodness is the aesthetic perception of beauty. So he's offering that there's another category to looking and experiencing things that may not be beautiful, but that has equal validity. And so I'm giving you two details of Matthias Grunewald's Eisenheim altarpiece. It's an example of what I think Danto has in mind when he says that by studying the truly ugly, you could actually get some knowledge that was perfectly valid. And so you just need to look at the gruesome details of the feet of the crucified Christ in the Eisenheim altarpiece, and then the deposed Christ here, and see the kind of sores and horrible treatment of flesh that so subsumed Grunewald as he's making these works, and understand that they had a positive value for the worshippers at Colmar, many of whom were plague-stricken when they confronted this work, and it was meant to provide them with a means towards thinking through to their own salvations. Or think about the kind of terrible actions in a painting by Caravaggio like this one, which is Judith beheading Holofernes, and the kind of terribilita that Sally described as being part and parcel of the power of a work. You could admire its bravura brushwork and the ways in which Caravaggio realistically captures this scene of incredible violence, but at some point you're left stuck with the blood and the viscera of this work, and that itself could be a meaningful thing, is something I want to rescue for even contemporary art. And I think that when Tracy Emin's bed was, pointed to that nothing could be more ugly than this, her personal bed with all of its tissues and other accoutrements. And now when you see it staged within the Tate Modern in England, actually it's at the Tate Britain, it has this kind of revered quality as art that I don't think Emin ever attempted for it to have. So I thought what I would like to do, a little bit different from Matt and Sally, is try to come up with some categories, useful categories of the ugly, and see how they've circulated throughout the history of art. And I think I've given these all names, although you could give them your own names, it occurs to me. And I think about an artist like Whistler, who I study, and the mistaking of the disorderly for the ugly that took place around the creation of a work like this, which I think visitors to the Detroit Institute of Arts tend to think of as one of the most beautiful things in that museum. But at the time it was shown, John Ruskin pronounced it the same as flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, and wrote voluminously about how Mr. Whistler should be really taken out and flogged for his act of insulting the public. I'm just going to paraphrase, for making this image, which has come to be seen as this really seductive, beautiful nocturne in line with Whistler's other works, but which was fundamentally unseeable for its disorder by Ruskin and his peers in 1877. So that might be one category. Another might be the vulgar, which I'm showing you Ad Reinhardt's cartoon for an abstract expressionist work of art, where the sort of hatted, gray-suited gentleman laughs at the painting saying, "Ha ha, what does this represent?" And the painting yells back, "What do you represent?" Right? It's a kind of assault back from the object on that placid way of inhabiting the world, which ultimately abstract expressionism wanted to disrupt. And Tim Clark is probably the best at explaining how we might really do well to rethink all of abstract expressionism, not in terms of its beauty, but in terms of its sheer vulgarity, the way it grabs you by the throat and insists that you think differently about the world once you've encountered this thing. And so we shouldn't mistake the vulgar for the ugly, but they could be, and they have been, is my point. Or the absurd, which Eva Hesse, once talking about this particular work called Hang Up, described it as so absurd, right? This little piece of steel comes, I'm sorry for that, out of this structure, and it comes out a lot. It comes out about 10 or 11 feet out, and it's ridiculous. It's the most ridiculous structure I've ever made, and that is why it is really good, she says. It has the kind of depth I don't always achieve, and that is the kind of depth or soul or absurdity or life or meaning or feeling that I want to get. And so this idea that a work of art could reach out and actually embrace all of us and sort of hook us into its own separate logic might be mistaken for ugliness by some, probably still is today by some who visit the Art Institute of Chicago, but that couldn't be further from the intention of the artist who produced it. Or the abject would be another mistaken quality. So I'm showing you a painting by Andy Warhol, one of his oxidation works, which he produced by coating large sheets of canvas with copper paint, and then by urinating on them, created these oxidation paintings, which shocked people. But Warhol himself said, beauty in danger becomes more beautiful, but beauty in dirt becomes something ugly. What makes a painting beautiful is the way the paint's put on. And in this case, we know how this paint was put on. And Warhol seems to be pushing against the borders of what we would, might mistake for beauty and abjection in the oxidation works. And I think from Warhol's concept of the dirty, we need to move only a little further to the kind of dirt that one finds in works by Cindy Sherman. This is a large-scale photograph of Sherman's from 1986. And I think if you look at the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who in an essay about purity and danger says there's no such thing as absolute dirt. It exists in the eye of the beholder. So she's turned this idea of beauty being only something that exists for the beholder to its other, to the ugly. And she said dirt offends against order. This is Douglas's great point. It is matter out of place. That's how she categorizes dirt. Eliminating it is not a negative movement, but a positive effort to organize the environment. So seen in Douglas's terms, these paintings, which run this thin line between the dirty and the abject in both Warhol's work and I think in these photographs by Sherman, I mean, it has this strong positive valence to it. Or another potential mistake we might have is to think of the ugly as the indifferent, and maybe the great example of this is Richard Serra's Tilted Arc public artwork in downtown Foley Federal Plaza, New York, which was made in 1981 as part of the FSA's Art in Public Places program, but destroyed in 1989 when too many people felt that it was an eyesore. And even Grace Gluck, a critic who I sometimes admire, said of Tilted Arc, it's an awkward, bullying piece that may conceivably be the ugliest piece of outdoor art in the city. But in fact, what was so objectionable, I think, about Tilted Arc to many of the people who experienced it was its complete indifference to the public and how the public in general might experience it as a block to their normal inhabiting of that space. The monstrous also comes close to the ugly, and I'm thinking of work by the French artist Orlan, who has through decades now been undergoing these body modifications to change her own appearance as her work of art. So her own self has become the work, and the cosmetic surgeries that she's had, the implants that she's placed in her face have all been part of this work, which many have found object, but which she calls carnal art. And she says carnal art loves the mockery and the Baroque, the grotesque, and other negative styles, since it opposes itself to social pressures, the burden of which is carried by both the human body and the work of art. So here she collapses her own practice with that art-making object, which has so troubled many of her beholders. And then I think there's a short leap from that to this idea of mockery in the work of art. So I think nobody does this better, to my mind, than John Curran, who's made a career out of these mocking but beautifully painted, to use that word, images of sort of middle class, upper middle class existence. And Curran himself says his work is not ironic, right? It was a conscious effort, instead of being critical, to just mock, to simply put out there the power of a mocking image on society as a whole, or instead of being critical, to do a caricature. And while many people have noted Curran's ugliness and the seeming hostility of these works, I think that there's something different from that. And finally, I'm just going to conclude this long list now of categories that might be mistaken for the ugly with just the sheer difficult. And the difficulty of works of art, for instance, right now there's a really important Jasper Johns retrospective at the Broad Art Museum in Los Angeles called Something Resembling Truth. And a large part of Johns's late career had been to produce, actually much of Johns' career has been caught up with producing these really difficult works that don't respond to calls for beauty in any way. And so this is from a large series that Johns began around 2013, 2014 called Regrets, all of which feature this label in one part or another of them, Regrets Jasper Johns, which you need to know grows out of a rubber stamp that he had made so that he would reply to all the countless invitations he received to dinner parties and museum openings with just a quick rubber stamp, Regrets Jasper Johns. And so that's the primary motivating feature for these works. But in their own way, as obdurate as they are and how unyielding to efforts to interpret them as they may be, they are difficult works of art, yet strangely beautiful in their construction. This pooled ink on mylar that Johnson's drawings have been practicing, or he practices in his drawings for the last 20 years or so. And this is Johns painting one of these works, and the critic Carter Ratcliffe, it seems to me, had it almost right when he said he's the painter who celebrates the mysterious and the shamelessly beautiful, by which I think he means the shamelessly difficult to take in. And it's a category that I think Burke also praises, is the difficulty of appreciating the beautiful and the sublime that may lead to a resolution of what is just beauty and just ugly. So that's the interior of the Eisenheim altarpiece. So this is that renewal that one is granted once they've finished contemplating all the ugliness on the predella and also on the exterior of the panel. That's it. Any questions? Yes?
Yeah, I want to ask a question. It seems to me like with contemporary art, part of the thing is a kind of rejection of the transcendental. I mean, Plato, you have this idea that beauty comes out of understanding of the whole. The problem with that idea is that in order to get to the whole, you have to go through a series of processes of parts which you don't understand. So therefore, in a sense, if you think about the whole, you don't know the whole until you get to the end. And at the end, there's like, it never comes, so you can't even start because you can't make a judgment. So it seems to me a lot of contemporary art has to do with the process of unfolding, of becoming. Earlier today, I was at the Museum of Man, and I saw the point where, many vases and so forth, and I just couldn't help when the whole thing was there, that I kind of noticed how imperfect it was. And there was one piece which is a fragment, I believe it was a fragment, and it was sort of somewhat broken up. And some accidents had happened, and so the accidents in the process has kind of like integrated into the original piece, which was itself a fragment. And what you end up doing is you kind of accept the fact that it wasn't complete and how it integrated itself with the process that's not even by the artist. So that therefore, in a sense, it incorporated something more, because it allowed it to unfold into a broader understanding of what might be possible in the process. I wonder whether you could say something about the idea of the transcendent object, which you strive for, and the process of becoming, which is kind of unknowing, which heads to a kind of indefined position. And maybe that might be a kind of fruitful relationship between beauty and the kind of, and the sublime.
Well, I could take a stab. I mean, I'll seize on the word process, because I think that's a really interesting one, and because I think it's, you know, the sort of, as you mentioned, the sort of like the sort of constancy of the struggle to reach something, I think is something that's interesting. And so I think it's a very useful term, certainly, that I use in the classroom, because we spend most of our time in the process of making things, and when they are finished because of deadlines, we spend most of our time talking about how they were made and how we can understand what was made. So there's a sort of a process, even when there is this sort of this pivot from the making is done and the looking begins. It's just a temporary pause in a sort of ongoing conversation, an ongoing process. I think one of the things that was so interesting about that list that Derrick just made, that sort of broke down ugly into all these different parts, is how each one of those categories and each one of those descriptions, whether it was a description of a sort of you know, the Eva Hess that comes out into our space sort of dimensionally, or something that's using a material that shouldn't be used, it's a dirty material, or you know, addressing emotions that are sort of emotions that aren't dignified or everyday, mocking or something like that. The fact that he each one of those categories draws attention to our world, I think, in a way that that allows for passage out of art into our world, and by implication that you can go from our world back into art. So I think process, not just in terms of artwork, but I think process being an indication of the fact that there can be you can think of a really permeable barrier between, I mean, art and life. I'll just say the sort of cliches. So that was my reaction to your comment. Sally, do you have any?
Process for sure, tremendously important. Transcendence, artist by artist. It's not, I think it's not something that I think of as at the heart of modern art. I think, I think of that as something associated with specific artists, perhaps, but not in general. But I think a really, really interesting issue, thought notion to put in the mix.
And I'll also say that, you know, in thinking about alternatives to the word beauty, you know, I'm look for a language in the classroom, and that acts and looks more like our culture, is diverse, dynamic, and active. So I think that a process as an end result, process as an end goal. I mean, I think it's a realistic thing to think about, sort of this constant adaptation.
Please.
I'm not really sure how I'm going to phrase this, but I'm going to do it. So it's interesting because when you think, well, I'm sorry, when I think of art, I think of beauty as like a synonym for like value or valuable. And I didn't know about this like contemporary push to like move away from beauty or to define it specifically and like how you mean it. And so it's just very interesting how you broke it down into these categories, because I tend to think of things that are like per se ugly as things we see as not very valuable. And so when you talk to, I think her name is Elaine, the philosopher that you're reading, her first and second arguments like pretty much broke it down in the way that I had previously understood it, where she said that like initially it's a turning away from things that we don't see as valuable, and then secondly it's like a assigning a value. And I guess I completely understand why artists would want to have their things like be seen as beautiful, because collectively beauty is something that we like value. So when they say that like it becomes more valuable when it's in danger, it's because people hate when they take valuable things away from them. And so it's just like it begins to make me like critically think about why we think that art should in fact be beautiful and that kind of stuff. So it just, I appreciate what you did, because it reclaims like the idea that art can be something other than beautiful, and there's value in things that are not like inherently or societally beautiful. Because I think that beautiful is, like you're saying, super subjective, relatively individual, and like accrued, like aggregated by society and given to us. It's something that we can like if we can collectively decide something is beautiful, then we can socialize. And so like I just think that's like I appreciate like the reclamation of, you know, art for art and not like art for beauty.
Yeah. Well, I think Sally did such a nice job of sort of pointing to the example of Duchamp as this moment where artists are parting from that whole game and that set of terms by which art would be valued. I think you put it in the context of the First World War, and how could you go on trying to make beautiful things in the face of such horror? And so Duchamp's solution, I think, put crudely, is to look at another model which doesn't hold up. He says it's an accident that he created something beautiful, and I think from that moment on, if not before, you have artists very self-consciously moving away from those set of rules for how the game would be played.
Definitely. I just thought it was like incredible how you broke it down, because it's like all these things you think considered to be like inconvenient, unattractive, things that we don't want to pay attention to, and I just feel like that's like so in line with what we do as like a society, as like a culture. Like it's ugly because it's inconvenient, it's like too large, it's absurd, and like all these kinds of things, it's difficult to deal with. We always want convenience, like immediate, and it's just like, wow, I didn't know that you could do that, but I just learned something.
But I'm thankful for your comment, because I think it just states a really important thing, which really bluntly, which is a sort of connection between sort of a universal definition of something being entirely dependent on the time and the place, the circumstances, economic, social, political, otherwise, that determination is being made. And I think that, so much of, art history in the last, the practice, so many disciplines are sort of reclaiming or trying to complicate their past, because their past was one of exclusion and one of forceful or otherwise. So I think that is, certainly I'm conscious of when I try to find other, and look to my students, for example, to define things. I'm consciously trying to find a way of having a communal dialogue that doesn't rest on universal notions. And I think that when I'm talking about visual engagement, and I think that there can be, Sally talked about inspiration and motivation, and I think that that's hugely important, right? I think having something that motivates you and inspires you, whatever it might be, that moves you to lose words, whatever it is hugely, hugely important. But I make the point to my students, nobody cares. As long as you produce something from that, because the act of communication is outward looking, so be really inspired and make something really great that communicates really interestingly. But nobody cares. I don't care. I don't care what motivates something. I care what the thing is and how it goes.
Appreciate that.
So Matt, at one point you were speaking about intuition, and if I followed what you were saying, you were suggesting a kind of isolated or individual sense of beauty that takes place on the intuitive level. In other words, that it perhaps tends towards a less communal, even more isolating way to look at art, if you're relying on the naked, if you're relying on the intuitive. And then I was thinking of the Elaine Scarry book, which part of her argument, as I recall, is that the value of beauty is that it creates the possibility of more social understandings of objects, and that's why it gets to justice, because she's trying to get from beauty to justice.
Right.
So I'd just be curious to hear if anyone wants to reflect upon the ways that beauty can become more socializing or less socializing, or does it? If we pay too much attention to beauty, which way does that take us?
I'll begin by saying I think everything I showed you is beautiful, in a sense. But I mean that in the sense that I think a mathematical principle is beautiful. That is, it does what it's doing really, really right. You know what I mean? It sets it up, it distills it, it does just what it should do. It means what it should mean, and so on. So, thought about in that way, yes, I think that kind of force of conviction and so on actually has power in the world. So I think a work like Mark Bradford's work, which may not have looked beautiful to anybody but me, has a certain kind of grandeur and or beauty. Not because there's anything beautiful about what it's about, but because of the way it accomplishes what I think it's trying to do, if that makes sense, the way it embodies. So I think for me, art embodies its meaning, if I can put it that way. And I don't mean a meaning that's simple and that's just decoded like, in some simple way, but it embodies it literally in the way that it's made, or the best stuff for me. So I suppose I'm of course always going to keep my distance when talking about art from the word beauty, because it's got a lot of baggage of universalizing and, do you know what I mean, and so on. But the truth is, back in the back of my imagination, whatever word I would use is sort of does that make sense? But it's getting at it in terms of the way that something accomplishes what it's doing, embodies what it's trying to. And I think that affects people. I think that actually is effective in the world. Yeah.
No, I'll answer because I did throw one of my paintings up there. If I can just say within my process, the role that intuition plays. I mean, I'm an intuitive artist, basically. I work intuitively. I respond. I'm in the studio. I'm present with these materials. My studio is set up to sort of reward the way my body wants to move. I mean, there's a lot of comfort, and I don't mean ease. I mean comfort and sort of it's that I've set up and I've moved in a way that reflects what my body wants to do, and that feels good. So that's present. But I don't want to then look up and say, like, it's intuitive. I can't talk about it, right? So there is this sort of rhythm of intuitive making, and then sort of stepping back and sort of looking and decision making about what's been made. So there isn't a wholesale acceptance of intuition. There is an understanding that it's a part of a process, and it's a key part for me of how I produce results. And images that, again, operate spatially, and then took me a long time to figure out how to talk because I was so wrapped up in it. But I think the question about how do you sort of scale that up to, or how that then communicates or forms social bonds or forms a social setting is, I think I don't think I have a great answer for it. I think it's a really interesting question. But thinking about emotions, that Marvin Minsky text, I think there has to be a lot of patience, right? If you're understanding that emotions are a key part of motivating getting things done. Like frustration is a narrative, that you wanted to get somewhere and you couldn't get somewhere, and feeling frustrated means that you don't want to stay in this place of not getting there, that you want to then, it motivates you to get there, right? So like how much emotions dictate or help us achieve concrete goals in everything we do. And yet there are feelings, right? So they're very intimate and they're personal, and yet to be able to then sort of talk about and articulate that requires acceptance of, acceptance of unknowing, which I think is something we could do a lot more of as a society. So I think it's good training, maybe.
Yeah. Actually, I was going to respond to you in a way. So one can undo beauty by saying that, of course, there's an intuitive and personality, right? That it's a highly subjective. But I think it's also important, and I was very grateful to Sally, who brought up, and she was the only one to bring it up, how gendered beauty actually is, and in fact how racialized it is, and in fact how so darn it is.
What was the last part?
Western,
yeah.
So in other words, I think we all ended up tonight with a notion of, in other words, the notion of beauty that we're undoing carries within it forms of violence and exclusion. And what is hidden in universality and transcendence is beauty posing as obvious, natural. Of course the odalisque is beautiful, she's she's white, she's submissive. Of course the women are crying in the corner while men stand up brave for the public sphere. Right? So to me that's the problem with the universal and the transcendental, that it is violent. you know, and then that's why we should be careful when we say, this campus is beautiful, right? Or this painting is beautiful. What is it that we are forcing ourselves to accept as natural and as, you know, as agreed upon, without thinking about what is it that we're also preventing from being revealed?